If you're afraid to spend your money in retirement, you are probably going to die too rich, leaving millions of dollars on the table that you never got to enjoy. And here's why. The system is designed to scare you out of spending your money. I'm going to show you the exact type of retiree that this happens to most often. And then I'm going to show you the financial planning software that 99% of retirees will never see that proves that you can spend way more. So let me get right to the question. Who is the retiree I'm talking about? Well, it's someone who's saved diligently and done the responsible thing. And then you turned to trusted experts for help planning your retirement spending. But here's what you didn't realize. Those trusted experts have an incentive to scare you into hoarding and out of spending. They've done a miraculous job convincing you that it's for your protection, when in reality, it's really for their protection. The more scared you are, the more you hoard your money. The more you hoard, the more fees they collect. It's kind of like a sleight of hand trick. They make you think that conservative spending protects you when it actually just protects their revenue and profits. And what makes this so effective is that it exploits the retiree's deepest fear, which is running out of money, and that turns that fear into their corporate profits. So let me prove to you that this isn't speculation. Retirees are dramatically underspending, and they are dying with millions of unspent money that they should be enjoying while they're healthy and alive. So on the screen here is research from David Blanchett and Michael Fink. And they looked at what retirees actually withdraw from their savings. Not what they're told to withdraw, but what they really do in actuality. And they found that 65-year-old married households were withdrawing only 2.1% of their portfolios annually. For single households, the number was even lower at 1.9%. So think about that. The so-called safe withdrawal rate is 4%. The industry has been telling you for 30 years that 4% is the conservative baseline. And the average retiree is actually withdrawing half of that amount. To add insult to injury, according to this research here from financial planner Michael Kitces, retirees who use the 4% rule or for a 4% initial withdrawal rate finish their 30-year retirement with more than double their starting wealth in over 2/3 of scenarios. In fact, in about 20% of scenarios, they end with 5 times their starting wealth. Now, 2/3 of the time, you end with more than double. So retirees are already withdrawing half of what they're told is safe from that research by David Blanchett and Michael Fink. And even those who do follow the 4% rule are still going to end up dying extremely rich. And then this third piece of research here from the Financial Planning Association studied high wealth retirees and found that even after they set aside 40% of their assets for healthcare, longevity, and gifting, there's still a consumption gap as high as 47%. So that means they could be spending nearly double what they are and still be perfectly safe. So the data here is pretty clear. Retirees aren't just slightly underspending. They're living on fractions of what even the most conservative guidance says is safe. That means they're going to end up dying with fortunes that they could have enjoyed. And so here's the question. If this problem is so well documented, why hasn't it been solved? Well, the truth is, it has been solved, and the solution has been around for nearly a decade. But if the industry had their wish, then you wouldn't find out about it for another decade or maybe even multiple decades. Because once you see the solution, you can never go back to seeing the world through the fear-based lens that you've been manipulated into using. Now, the craziest thing here is that advisors and financial services business alike know that there's a better method of retirement planning. One that could give clients confidence to spend more, to sleep better at night, and overall have a much better quality of life. But according to Michael Kitces' annual financial advisor software survey, only 1% of advisors are using that solution, right? That's 1 out of 100. So why would 99% of advisors avoid a tool that could give clients more clarity and more confidence in retirement? Now, before I answer that question, I'm sure you're itching to know what that tool is. Well, that tool is risk-based modern guardrails. Instead of one static number, like the 4% rule, and a prayer, guardrails will tell you exactly how much you can spend, when you would need to adjust that spending, and by how much. That system will give you clarity and confidence and permission to spend. And that method is delivered best by this tool here called Income Labs, which is one of the leading guardrails tools. The math in Income Labs is peer-reviewed. Income Labs has been featured in every major financial planning publication. And so now back to that original question, why would 99% of advisors avoid a tool that gives clients more clarity and more confidence? And the answer is because guardrails do something dangerous to the financial services sector's business model. These guardrails give you permission to spend. And when you spend more of your money, your balances and portfolios will shrink over time, which means that these financial services companies' fees shrink. So that 4% rule and those scary Vanguard reports that you might read, they keep you hoarding your money, right? Guardrails, they set you free. So which one do you think will protect the revenue, and which one do you think is better for you as a retiree? Now, here's the thing. Even the big institutions know that retirees underspending is a problem. Even JP Morgan, who makes billions managing assets, analyzed 5 million households and concluded that static rules like the 4% rule cause dramatic underspending. They said that withdrawals going forward will require a more dynamic approach. And yet your advisor still won't show you this alternative. So let me show you what this dynamic approach actually looks like, and you'll see exactly why they don't want you to know about it. So we're going to look at a real example. I'm going to change identifying details for privacy, but this is based on an actual client situation, and I think you'll see a bit of yourself in this story. So meet Steve and Amanda, who are both 65 years old, and they have $1.2 million saved. At full retirement age, Steve will get $3,400 a month from Social Security, and Amanda will receive $2,100. When retirement approached, they did what you probably did or are doing, and they turned to Vanguard and online trusted experts. They learned about the 4% rule. They used all the trusted sources. Now, before they came to speak to me, they'd been told by their previous advisor to stick to a 4% withdrawal rate. So to withdraw no more than $48,000 in their first year from their portfolio. Now, they planned to claim Social Security at 67, 2 years from now, and that would give them a total gross income between that $48,000 and their Social Security of around $115,000 a year once those benefits kicked in. But here's the thing. They told me that at the time when they were thinking through this, they felt anxious every time they were thinking about spending money. They'd look at their portfolio balance and think, is this going to last? Should we cancel this trip? Should we stop giving gifts to our daughter? They were actually, in reality, withdrawing closer to $35,000 a year, so barely 3% of their portfolio, because that fear was so overwhelming. They were living well below even their advisor's already conservative recommendation. And as I said earlier, they're not alone. Remember that research earlier showing that the average withdrawal rate is 2.1%. Well, Steve and Amanda were textbook examples of what the fear-based system creates. And so I ran their situation through Income Labs with risk-based modern guardrails, and here's what it showed them. For the first 2 years, from ages 65 to 67, before their Social Security kicks in, Income Labs recommended that they could safely withdraw $118,000 per year from their portfolio. That was more than double what their advisor told them was safe. It was more than 3 times what they were currently withdrawing. And then at age 67, on this next screen here, you can see that once Social Security starts, so about $69,000 in combined income, their portfolio withdrawals would step down to about $52,500 of additional withdrawals. But their total income would remain roughly the same, a little increase. It would go up to about $122,000. Now, Steve and Amanda just stared at me and said, that can't be right. Steve says, how is that safe? What if we're wrong about the life expectancy? What if markets crash? And I told Steve, those are all great questions, and I'm going to answer them in just a minute. But first, let me show you the planning behind what I showed Steve and Amanda. See, we planned for Steve to live till age 90 and Amanda to live till age 95. So that's 25 years for the male and 30 years for the female, respectively. Those are well beyond average life expectancy. So we were not cutting any corners on longevity. And then we tested this plan using a Monte Carlo system against thousands of possible scenarios, historic-based scenarios. And here's what we found. In 93 out of 100 scenarios, they'd actually get permission to increase their spending beyond what we've already discussed. Now, Amanda looked at Steve and she basically said, we've been living off of $35,000 a year in withdrawals, terrified every time we spent a dollar, and we didn't need to. And that's exactly right. This is what a fear-based system creates, right? You follow the advice, you trust the experts, and you end up living scared. But here's what I haven't shown you yet. And this is the number that's going to make you really sick to your stomach, which is what the fear has actually been costing Steve and Amanda. I'm going to show you that calculation in just a minute. And when you see it, you're going to understand why the title of this video says you're going to die too rich. But first, Steve's question was still hanging there. His question was, how does this stay safe when things go wrong? And that's where the next 3 things I'm going to show you come into play. So let me show you exactly how this plan protects them and how you can apply the same framework to your situation. Remember Steve's question. It was, what if the markets crash? How does this stay safe? So the answer is there are 3 numbers and 1 bonus metric that I'm going to show you that make this whole system work. And I call those the 3 sliders. And this is where guardrails becomes completely different from any type of static withdrawal system you've been taught. So the first slider is what we call the probability of spending adjustment. And this is the likelihood that you'll need to make a spending change during your retirement. On the screen here, you can see this. For Steve and Amanda, we set this to a 25% probability of a spending adjustment. That means there's a roughly 1 in 4 chance that they'll hit a guardrail, which is the trigger point that tells them when they need to adjust their spending at some point in retirement. You can adjust that slider based on your risk tolerance. If you want to be more conservative, you can set it at 1%. If you want to be willing to accept more volatility and therefore spend more, you can set it at 40%. But you need to know this number and not just hope that it works out. Then we have a second slider. The second slider is attached to the first. Slider number 2 is what we call spending adjustment size. And this is how much you cut your spending if you hit your lower guardrail. Again, that trigger point. For Steve and Amanda, we set this at 5%. So remember those numbers earlier. $122,000 of spending when Social Security kicks in. Well, if markets crashed and Steve and Amanda's portfolio dropped enough to trigger their lower guardrail, they would cut spending by 5%. That means spending $115,000 instead of $122,000 once Social Security kicks in, right? It's a very, very small spending adjustment that's almost meaningless in the context of their actual lifestyle. Remember, before they came to speak to me, they were living on $35,000 in withdrawals, plus what they were expecting Social Security to kick in, so about $101,000 in total. So even in a disastrous scenario, with a 5% spending cut using guardrails, they still be living on $116,000, which is 15% more than in the prior scenario where they were just living out of fear. Here's the critical part. This adjustment isn't permanent. When markets recover and their portfolio value moves back into their guardrails, they can increase their spending once again. So it's a dynamic system, not a static system. Now, some people prefer larger spending adjustments, say 10%, with a wider guardrail, and therefore they accept larger spending cuts that happen less frequently. Other people prefer smaller spending adjustments that happen more frequently with slightly tighter guardrails. It's totally up to your preference. The key here is that this number needs to be something you could actually live with. If your plan requires a 30% spending cut when the market drops 20%, that's not a plan. That's a recipe for panic and bad decisions. Now this leads us to the third slider, which is what we call the guardrail width. The guardrail width determines how much your portfolio needs to decline before hitting that trigger point where an adjustment is necessary. So for Steve and Amanda, their lower guardrail was set at 22%. So that means that their portfolio could decline by 22% in value before they trigger that 5% spending adjustment. Now, it requires a pretty significant market correction, bigger than most of the pullbacks we experience, for their specific portfolio to see a 22% correction. But it's not so wide that their first adjustment would require a catastrophic spending adjustment. So finally here, to answer Steve's direct question, if their portfolio were to drop by 22%, they'd make a 5% spending cut. That's the mechanism by which this is made safe, because the guardrails tell us that over historic downturns or historic market periods, this type of a spending adjustment, given their demographics, would have brought their plan back to safety. And this means that Steve and Amanda don't have to rely on hope and prayers, right? They have a specific predetermined set of mechanics that tell them what they need to do in order to bring their plan back to safety. Now, there's a bonus metric, and this is what we call the probability of a spending increase. Here's something most advisors will never tell you. You need to know not just how likely you are to get spending reductions in retirement, but also how likely you are to deserve or earn raises in retirement. So remember that 93% number from Steve and Amanda's original plan, from Steve and Amanda's plan that we talked about earlier. Well, when we tested their guardrail strategy against thousands of historic market scenarios, in 93% of those scenarios, they would have had the opportunity to spend more money than originally planned, meaning they would have triggered upper guardrails and gotten a raise at some point in their retirement. And so the historical data shows that this plan is biased towards them living better than expected, not worse than expected. Now, most advisors never show you this number because, again, it reveals just how conservative their static recommendations really are. And so here's what you need to understand. These numbers are in your control. You get to decide your probability of a spending adjustment. You get to decide what your adjustment size will be, and you get to decide what type of lower guardrail width you're comfortable with. The industry doesn't want you to know that you have these things to control. They want you following simple, rigid rules that leave you dependent on them. Things like the 4% rule that keep you permanently conservative, permanently scared, and permanently wondering if you can afford that trip to see your grandkids. Now, remember that I said I was going to show you that what living in fear was actually going to cost Steve and Amanda. Well, here's that number. For the first 2 years, from ages 65 to 67, before Social Security kicks in, Steve and Amanda were going to be withdrawing $35,000 from their portfolio. When their guardrails showed they could have safely taken as much as $118,000 for each of those years in the 2-year period. That's $166,000 in foregone life experiences, right? Then from age 67 onward, once Social Security started in their conservative scenario, they would have been living on $101,000 between withdrawals and Social Security. But with their new guardrail scenario, they would have been living on $122,000. So that's a roughly $21,000 a year that would have been left on the table. And over the 28 remaining years until Amanda's age 95, that adds up to over $500,000 over that 28-year period. So in total, between the first 2 years and the remaining 28, that's over $650,000 in cumulative unspent monies that could have been used for their life. Now, I want you to think about what $650,000 really represents, right? That's not just some random number on a spreadsheet. That's trips to see your grandkids. That's maybe paying for your grandkids' college. That's a kitchen renovation or home improvement project. That's end-of-life care. That's helping their daughter when she really needs it. And it's 30 years or 10,950 days, almost 11,000 days of second guessing their financial decisions, right? Every plane ticket, every dinner out, every gift to the grandkids. 3 decades of living in fear of spending when they didn't have to. But here's the most important part. Even if they had been living that fuller life, even if they'd spent that extra $650,000 on experiences, the median outcome for their legacy, their expected end-of-life assets, they would still die leaving over $800,000 to their kids. And in better scenarios, they leave as much as $1.2 to as much as $2.6 million. And so let me paint you the full picture. They were planning to sacrifice over $650,000 worth of lifetime spending, experiences that they could never replace, to live close to 11,000 days in fear of spending every day, to die with money that they'd never see, money that their kids would inherit without ever knowing what their parents gave up to leave it to them. At this point, Amanda looked over to Steve and said, "We've been leaving over $600,000 of life on the table if we were to choose to live in that conservative manner. And we would still end up dying with nearly $1 million in the most likely scenario that we never get to enjoy." And that's what dying too rich really means. It's not just about the balance at the end of your life. It's all the life you didn't live to get to the end of life. It's the grandkids that you didn't get to spoil. It's the trips you didn't get to take. It's the gifts to your kids or your community that you didn't get to give. Right? It's dying with money in the bank and regret in your heart. And it's entirely preventable. So at this point, if you don't want to be Steve and Amanda before they found this new system, if you don't want to leave hundreds of thousands of dollars of life on the table, I recommend that you watch a free class I've recorded called The 4-Step System to Planning Your Dream Retirement. In it, I'll walk you through the complete framework for confident retirement spending, including how to use guardrails, how to optimize Social Security, and how to handle healthcare before Medicare. Just click the link in the description below this video or scan the QR code that's flashing on the screen now to register. Thank you as always for your time and attention. See you in the next video.